Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our class. Again, this is SS031, SS031 UTS or Understanding the Self. And still, this is Sir E, Professor Erland de Veraplan, your online facilitator for your class. And today, our discussion will be focusing on the material self, cogito ergo consum, or consumer culture, and the material self. If you happen to see this one, you see cogito ergo consum. This means you are what you buy. This is coming from, this was actually taken from Rene Descartes, cogito ergo sum, right? Which means I think, therefore I am. Right? So tinanggal lang po natin dito yung sum at ginawa nating cogito ergo consum. Okay? You are what you buy. Again, our discussion for today is all about the material self, consumer culture, and the material self. And here are our learning outcomes. Number one, we will establish the nuances of the material self. Number two, we will elaborate on the interrelationship between consumer culture and the material self. Number three, we will identify the different perspectives through which the material self is seen. Number four, we will determine the importance of the interplay of signs and symbols in the broader context of consumer culture. Lastly, we will examine the self against the different concepts and ideas relating to its material aspects. As we begin our discussion on the material self, have your parents ever bought something, say for example, a designer center table from your local shopping mall and returned home only to realize how all the furnitures in your living room look so old and dusty in comparison? So what your parents did was to run back to the mall to buy other items, say for example a vase or a new rug, perhaps a new curtain to complement, okay, the designer center table, the one that they newly bought. If your answer to both is yes, then if your answer to both is yes, then the so-called Diderot effect, which is one of the most commonly experienced phenomena of consumption out there, has already taken hold of them. Again, that is what you call the Diderot effect. Now, the Diderot effect was first articulated through an essay entitled Regrets on Parting with My Old Dressing Gown by 18th century French philosopher Denis Diderot. These phenomena says that one innocent purchase can actually spiral into an endless cycle of complementary consumption. Okay, such is the sway of consumption in shaping an individual's desire to streamline the material self, meaning it does not actually stop with buying a new pair of something, because it would also extend to what? Buying a perhaps a new pair of shirt or maybe a new pair of watch to tie it all together. Now, in its widest possible sense, according to William James, a man's self is the sum total of all that he can call his. And that's the reason why here in SS31, we will be including the material self as part of understanding who we are, as part of understanding ourselves. Again, according to William James, in its widest possible sense, a man's self is the sum total of all that he can call his. Now, let's look first at the material self hierarchy. Of course, when you speak of the material self hierarchy, we will start first with the body, which is the most important. Next one is the clothing. The next one is family. And then you have the house. And then the last one is what we consider as the other properties. Again, this is the material self hierarchies. Now, for 19th century philosopher William James, an individual selfhood can be broken down into several fragments, with the material self being one. Aside from the physical body, which is considered the central constituent unit of the material self, because we need our body, okay, in order to be reflective of the concept of the material self. These facet of the self also includes one's closest relatives and is also inclusive of one's material possessions. According to Herman Lotze in his work Microcosmos, each time we get to wear garments of varying kind is a chance for us to bring into relationship with the surface of the body and inject with them the very consciousness of our personal existence. Ang sinasabi po rito ni Herman Lotze, whenever we buy, say, for example, our clothes, new clothes, okay, or a new pair of shoes, we bring those clothes, new clothes, and the new pair of shoes into a relationship with the surface of our body, thus injecting the very consciousness that ourselves is actually existing. Okay, that is how he tries to actually navigate the yung pagkakasama-sama, okay? Or yung pagkakatugma-tugma ng ating katawan, okay? Doon sa ating mga binibili. Of course, in the material self hierarchy, next to the body, clothes and family in the material self hierarchy are the properties. Say, for example, a house that one gets to acquire through time. Now, the accumulation of such comprises the empirical self's wealth. Okay, when we say empirical, meaning it's the experiential self-swap, the things that we experience in life. Say for example, yung yaman or yung mga properties na meron tayo and is thus perceived as most intimately ours because it is made possible by our labor. Now that you are still students, perhaps kakaunti pa lamang sa inyo yung makapagsasabi na meron kayong mga intimately yours because it was made possible by your labor. But perhaps meron na sa inyong naka-experience na magtrabaho at doon sa pagtatrabaho ninyo, meron kayong mga bagay na nabili and you feel like that those things are intimately yours because you worked hard for it. Now, in short, the purchase of an item is not just considered an investment. It is not just investment in the monetary sense, but also from the standpoint of the material self. Why? Because we develop an attachment in most of the things we buy because we accord the same to the resources that enables us to accomplish the transaction. Okay? Paano ka nakabili ng ganito? Kasi pinaghirapan mo, nagtrabaho ka. Or say for example, may pinagawa sa'yo ang parents mo at ang sabi ng parents mo, anak, pag ginawa mo ito, okay, maglinis ka ng bahay, bibigyan kita ng ganito. You worked hard for it. Now, this rationalizes our feeling of sadness upon losing some of our personal belongings. That's the reason why William James, again, in the face of material loss, accordingly, he said, considers this as the shrinkage of the personality. When we say shrinkage of the personality, this is what happens, okay, when we lose what we have or what we own. The reason why we die a little every time we lose some of our possessions. Halimbawa, nawala mo yung cellphone mo, parang hindi ka makakilos, hindi ka makapasok ng school. Why? Why? Because it has become a part of who you are. Right? Because kapag may nawawalang mga bagay sa atin, we feel like we have lost something about it. It's not part of our physical body, but it has become a part of who we are. Okay? And it has become a part of our personality. That's the reason why we feel like we die a little every time we lose some of our possessions. According to Benjamin Barber, he said consumerism has attached itself to a noble identity politics in which business itself plays a role in forging identities conducive to buying and selling. But the reality is when we buy something, we actually forge our identity because hindi ka naman bibili ng mga bagay na hindi mo gusto or sakto sa personalidad mo. To slightly modify a well-known aphorism, it says necessity is the mother of consumption. When we say necessity, these are the things which are necessary in order for us to live, in order for us to survive. These are not wants, because when we say wants, these are things that we can live without. Okay? You say necessity is the mother of all consumption. Again, when we say essentials like food and clothing are bought, and so is shelter. And in our every waking moment, we transact for goods and services. Say, in supermarkets and malls, we give away what is essentially the material manifestation of our labor, which is our money, in exchange for items. We are made aware of these items through commercial advertisements. Now, back then, our ideas about consumer items are picked up from print and TV. However, because of the advent of social media, information and goods and services are now able to reach us at a much faster rate. You talk about Facebook ads, you talk about YouTube ads, and whatnot. In effect, advertisers need only to strategically tap into our smartphones. The irrefutable fact is this: consumption, okay, yung ating pagbili, consumption has become so pervasive that it has become a second nature to all of us, part of our identity, even, particularly in the new normal where people are quite afraid to go outside. What do? We go online shopping, and consumption has become so online that it's become also second nature to all of us, part of our identity. Even now, the role of products and services in our lives are now above their literal purpose, for they have become the means through which we express our lifestyle. However, on the flip side, not every society puts premium on material consumption, because there are still agrarian societies where basic subsistence is the way of life. Food is not so much bought as they are planted and eventually harvested, meaning they are after the simplicity of life. They don't really care about having a lot of material stuff, meaning they're not very much materialistic. All they wanted to do is to survive day-to-day existence. Kakain, basta meron silang makain, mapagtrabahuhan, makain, okay na sa kanila yon. They're not after splurging. They're not really after buying a lot of stuff. Then, again, there are still some societies which are like that, particularly in the provinces. Now, these stands in stark contrast with many contemporary cultures, particularly in the West, which removes focus on austerity or simplicity while increasing emphasis on buying and buying and buying. Now, let's proceed with our discussion now on the science, the semiotics, or the semiotics of consumption. Let's face it, our everyday interactions are always governed by signs and symbols. Even outside linguistics, which is the study of language and literature, we still encounter systems of codes from which we try to decode and draw meaning. Okay, let's proceed now. According to Ferdinand de Saussure, meanings are based on conventions and are by nature arbitrary. Thus, words are considered unmotivated signs with no fixed definitions. Essentially, present always is what we call as the signifier. When we say a signifier, it could be a phrase, it could be a sound, or an image, a picture. And the signified, or the concept or abstraction attached to the signifier. Now, the relationship between the two is never stable and can change over time, either synchronically, meaning at a given point, or diachronically, meaning over a relative period of time. Now, let's look at the concept of the semiotics of consumption on the next slide, at least according to Ferdinand de Saussure. Now, here you can see the signifier. Okay, you will see here the signifier, and then you have the sign, and then you got the signified here. When we speak of the signifier, it talks about the physical existence of an object. So you talk about the sound, the word, or an image. When you speak of the sign, it speaks of the object or the thing. And the signified is actually the mental concept. When you see the sign or the object apple, it could either be a fruit, which is an apple. And when you think of an apple, it could be fresh, it could be healthy, it could also be linked with the concept of temptation, or you say the apple of the eye, meaning, say, for example, a teacher's pet. Or when you think of an apple, perhaps it could be a brand of a computer. Okay, so you see here the concept of the signifier, the sign, and the signified. Now, in addition, meanings assigned to words are said to be relational. That is, one cannot be defined in complete isolation from the other. Say, for example, the meaning of the word terrorist can only be clarified if compared and contrasted with similar ones. How about guerrillas, freedom fighters, or paramilitaries? Now, this is what we call as the paradigmatic chain, a continuum of words with identical functions that can serve as substitute for each other, though some may not be as neutral when used. Now, let's talk about symbols. Now, symbols are frequently seen as being imbued with very specific historical or cultural significations depending on one's social, cultural, or socio political background. Now, the foundations of subjectivity are determined by a person's linguistic status, okay, how broad the understanding of an individual about language is, or by the dominant discursive practices in his or her immediate context. Now, here we have two concepts, okay? We have the concept of denotation and the concept of connotation. Now, denotation, which means object language, is defined as the literal interpretation of a word or the literal interpretation of something. While when we talk about connotation, these pertains to culture specific meanings and ideologies. To give an example, on your screen right now, you will see the word dog. Now, when you say you are a dog, okay, in its denotative meaning, which is the literal meaning, that means you are literally a canine, right? But when you use the phrase "you are a dog" or the sentence "you are a dog," okay, in its connotative sense, that suggests that you are ugly or morally detestable. So that's the difference between the concept of denotation, which is again the literal meaning of a concept or a word, and the concept of the connotation, which is the implied or culturally suggested meaning of the word. Here we have another example. Fernando Po Jr., right? Late king of Philippine cinema. Now, the denotative meaning or the literal meaning of Fernando Po Jr. is that he is or he was an actor and a director who once run for president of our country. But when you talk about the suggestive or the cultural meaning of Fernando Po Jr., it has come to mean the idol of the masses and the champion of the poor, meaning he became the physical embodiment of righteousness and justice. Okay, I hope it's already clear how we try to differentiate the meaning between denotative and connotative meaning. Now, advertisers often strive to peddle to the public not just consumer goods, but also the ideologies and mystifications that they carry with them, according to Marx. Now, in doing so, habitually, say through the frequent airing of commercials on TV, the connotations become the natural, common sense reality products. Now, next, we have the five stages in Philip Kotler's buyer decision process. How does a consumer decide what to buy? So we have the five stages. The first one is needs arousal or needs recognition. The second one is information search. The next one is evaluation of alternatives. The fourth one is purchase decision. And the last stage is the post purchase behavior or the post purchase feelings. What do these stages mean? Let's look at the first one, which is needs arousal or needs recognition. Here, the buyer has a need to satisfy or a problem that needs solving. Okay? Nakita kang nasira na yung sole ng sapatos mo. So there's a problem, okay? Or a need to satisfy. Perhaps you're thinking, how can I resolve this problem? Perhaps, okay, isipin mo na, bibili ako ng sapatos. I need to buy a new pair of shoes. That is when the second stage, okay, in the process comes in, which is the information search, where buyers begin to look around to find out what's out there in terms of choice, right? Say, for example, you go through Lazada or Shopee, okay, or Alibaba, okay? You go through those online sites, okay, online shopping sites, to search for information, okay, about the different choices, okay, that you have, at least in buying a new pair of shoes. Now that's the second stage, which is the information stage. The third stage is the evaluation of alternatives. Now sees the evaluation of the available alternatives. This is when the buyer decides upon a set of criteria by which to assess each alternative. It could be what? Yung kakayanan mong bumili, it could be your budget. Okay, that's the evaluation of alternatives. Say, for example, you want to buy a new pair of shoes, but then again, you don't really have enough money to buy, so you will opt to buy what? A cheaper pair of shoes. Okay, so you check upon the different alternatives. Say, for example, you go through an online shopping site like Lazada. Sometimes nakakakita ka ng sapatos na pare-pareho yung design, pero iba-iba yung price. So you try to check on the different alternatives. Okay? That's the third stage, which is the evaluation of alternatives. The fourth one is the purchase decision. This is when buyers make the final choice of what to buy and from whom to buy it. Okay, so titingnan mo na ano ba ang bibilhin ko talaga, saan ko ito bibilhin. This is the stage when the buyer makes a decision on what to buy and from whom to buy it. And after buying, after purchasing a certain commodity, the last stage comes in, which is the post-purchase behavior or feelings. This is the process where the product or the service being consumed by the individual or business, okay, tawag dito, ginagawa mo na, iniisip mo kung tama ba, okay, or dinadamdam mo kung tama ba yung pakiramdam doon sa binili mo. This is the process continues even after the product is purchased, because you think of the feeling after being able to buy a particular commodity. Say, for example, you were able to buy a new pair of shoes online, and then ito'y na-deliver na sa inyo. It was already delivered in your house, and then that's when you try to feel, okay, how does it feel to have a new pair of shoes which is actually not so much quality. Okay, so for example, class A yung nabili mo. Or sometimes naman, kahit na class A, but then again, you feel very much satisfied. So you talk about the post-purchase behavior of an individual. This is also the reason why in many online shopping sites, makikita natin dito na meron silang review ng purchase. Right? So, were you satisfied? Were you dissatisfied? So, that's a part of the post-purchase behavior or feelings. On the flip side of it, John Calvin, a known theologist, said that if we are only to pass through earth, we ought to undoubtedly make such a use of earth's blessings as well, rather assist than retard in our journey. As I said a while ago, John Calvin is a Protestant theologian who argued passionately against the Catholic doctrine's espousal of asceticism. When we speak of asceticism, it is a lifestyle of radical simplicity, a lifestyle of austerity, often characterized by mental and physical discipline. Why is John Calvin very much against the concept of living a lifestyle of radical simplicity? Because for him, it is through the consumption of material goods that people can truly fulfill God's desires. However, he emphasized, though, that the material consumption and wealth accumulation should be done in moderation, because for him, a person's hard work justifies his or her consumption. Tama naman, di ba? Kapag ikaw ay kumikita, what do you do with your income? Right? It is only right for you to spend somehow your work, your income, because that's the product of your labor. That's the product of your work, right? The rich are assumed to be industrious lot, whose wealth was willed by God. The same logic applies to the poor people, who perhaps the reason why they are poor is because they do not work as hard, so their eventual deprivation of the divine beneficence, or what we call the divine wealth, are said to be deserved. Meaning, ang mga mayayaman ay yumayaman daw dahil ito ay kanilang pinaghirapan. That's the reason why God willed for them to be wealthy. While the poor, the reason why they are poor because they do not work. And they so deserve to be poor because they do not work. On the other side, we know of Karl Marx, who said that no production without a need. But for him, consumption reproduces that need. We know of Karl Marx as the father of Marxism. Now, the Marxist thought has positioned consumer culture within the capitalist economic model. Some academic disciplines believe in the consciousness determines society. However, for Karl Marx, it's the society that determines class consciousness. The irony, though, is that the consciousness of the proletariats, and when we talk about the proletariats, this is the working class. Okay, sila yung mga nagtatrabaho. He believes that the consciousness of the proletariats or the working class is heavily decided for them by the wealthy people or the ruling class. Okay, and the ruling class prevents the working class or the proletariats from developing class consciousness. Again, when we talk about the proletariats, these are the workers who have no means of production of their own, but are thus forced to sell their labor power to buy stuff and pay their bills. On the other hand, when we speak of the ruling class, they centralize power, okay, to itself and performs the majority of political functions in a given society. What is a class consciousness, by the way? This is the self awareness of individuals belonging to a specific class, which is used in this context as the workers collectively becoming more conscious of their rights and their ideological to the ruling class. Now, we know Karl Marx as the father of communism. Now, communism is very ideal in many sense, but somehow the idealism of communism um, can be understood because somehow it is giving so much voice to the proletariats or the working class. Ang sinasabi ni Karl Marx dito, dapat pantay-pantay ang lahat ng tao. Walang mayaman, walang mahirap. So, what is the best way to do this? According to Karl Marx, the best way for people to be equal is to overthrow the capitalists and what? Provide and give all the wealth of the wealthy people or the ruling class to all the people so that everybody would be equal. But that could not be so, right? Because may mga mayayaman naman na talagang pinaghirapan nila kung ano yung meron sila sa kasalukuyan. And another thing is that the downside of that concept is that kapag ikaw ay mahirap, posibleng hindi ka nalang magtrabaho dahil aasa ka na lamang doon sa yaman ng mga mayayaman para i-distribute sa'yo. Right? So even though the concept of Marxism or communism is very much ideal, it could not be so in the real world. Imposible siyang gamitin. That's the reason communism, okay, somehow dissipated in a way in our history. Say, for example, you talk about China, which was formerly a communist country, but right now it is not considered as a communist country, though there are still traces of communism in China at the moment. Now, the Marxist perspective also speaks of the concept of fetishism. This is a rather primitive belief, and it has its roots in anthropology that inanimate objects can be imbued with godlike powers. And then you have the concept as well of commodity fetishism, which pertains to how certain goods are given high monetary value with no regard for the labor that went into their creation. Effectively, such goods become fetishized commodities stripped of their human essence. The danger here is that many people might then view such said goods or products as if they harbor intrinsic value in and of themselves, even without human agencies. Labor in capitalist societies is often imposed and non-voluntary. Okay, definitely it's not voluntary because in capitalist societies it's like that. Under such conditions, individuals work to afford gratifying commodities, but never for its own sake. Thus, work becomes completely separate from the individual as it contains little to no need satisfying value. These leads to workers' apathy and eventual alienation from one's labors. Because labor is devoid of intrinsic importance to the self, the worker turns to consumption, for it is only through it that they experience enjoyment. The material self, to summarize our discussion, according to William James, is centered on the physical body, with emphasis on one's material possessions, the things that we buy, okay, everything that we own, and the family to which one belongs. Now, these figures in quite prominently within the broader context of consumerism or consumer culture, which tells of how consumption is normalized in a given society. And not only normalized in a given society, but consumption has been commercialized in a given society. These naturally affects identity formation. You become what you buy, as our material possessions and preferred lifestyles slowly become extensions of who we are. And that wraps up our discussion on cogito ergo consum, consumer culture, and the material self. Again, this is SS031, Understanding the Self, and this has been Sir E. Thank you for joining us in our discussion today. Till next time, this is Sir E again now, signing off.